You're keen to understand something vital, like how infrastructure is really shaping Africa's future.
Yeah.
But let's be honest, trying to wade through all the reports, the data, it can feel a bit much, right?
Definitely overwhelming sometimes.
You want those core insights, those aha moments that give you a real handle on things without getting totally lost in the weeds.
Exactly.
And that's precisely what we're tackling today.
Absolutely. Sure. We're talking infrastructure financing, development, what's happening right now across Africa.
Okay.
So we've looked at a pretty detailed white paper from NEPAD, that's the African Union's development agency.
Right, the official body.
Yeah. Plus some valuable perspectives from African Leadership magazine, practical insights from a group called Izenzo Consulting and Contracting.
Izenzo.
And also a look at the sustainability side of things, which is crucial, from Clyde & Co.
Okay, quite a mix then.
Yeah, a good range.
So our goal here is pretty straightforward. Basically, distill all this complex info, highlight the most critical bits, and, connect the dots so you get a solid understanding of the current landscape, the challenges, the potential paths forward, all of it.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's dive right in. This is Afrotake Article in Conversation. I am Nate, and my co-host is Janine.
This is Afrotake, the economic pulse of Africa, with Nate and Janine. Let's dive in.
This is part 2 of the infrastructure in Africa we covered before.
Yeah, part 1 is on Afrotake's site. We've provided a link below. The infrastructure gap itself.
Yeah, and what immediately jumps out from, all the sources is just the sheer size of the need.
How big are we talking?
We're consistently seeing figures between, say, $130 billion up to maybe $170 billion needed each year for infrastructure.
Wow, annually.
Annually. But the current committed investment, it's hovering around $80 billion a year.
Okay, so doing the math,
Yeah.
that's a shortfall of anywhere from $50 to $90 billion every single year.
Exactly. So when we talk about a gap, it's a really significant one.
Right. And who are the main players actually putting money down right now?
Well, African governments themselves are the biggest investors. They cover over 40% of that $80 billion. Donors are also significant, traditional aid partners. They account for about 35%. But, and this is a key shift, the IIDA NEPAD paper really highlights those traditional donor contributions. They're actually trending downwards.
Oh, interesting. Why is that? Or what's filling that space?
Well, the why is complex global priorities shifting, maybe. But what's becoming increasingly important, or visible anyway, is the engagement of China.
Ah, okay.
Their role is changing, evolving, and then the private sector provides the rest of the committed funds.
So with that donor landscape changing, the huge question is, where does the extra money come from? How do you bridge that, massive gap?
Yeah, exactly. And this is where you have to look at potential new or expanded avenues for funding.
Like what?
Well, boosting domestic resource mobilization is just crucial.
So government's collecting more taxes, basically.
Yeah, strengthening internal revenue collection, definitely. But also tackling that persistent drain from illicit financial flows. Money leaving the continent illicitly.
Right, plugging the leaks.
Exactly. Remittances, too, money sent home by Africans working abroad. That's a huge source, often underutilized in terms of formal investment channels.
Makes sense.
And look, global foreign direct investment, FDI, it's facing pressures everywhere. But good bankable projects in Africa, they can still attract serious capital.
Especially in certain sectors.
Yeah, the sources point specifically to things like green energy mega projects. Those are attracting attention.
Okay.
We're also seeing sort of the emergence of more innovative private funding models that could play a part.
And what about the aid that is still flowing?
That's important too. There's a growing recognition, you see it in things like the EU's Global Gateway Strategy, that the quality and effectiveness of aid spending needs to improve, making it more impactful.
Right, getting more bang for the buck, so to speak.
Precisely.
So it seems like a lot of strategic thinking must be going into planning and executing all this.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about the major frameworks, the big initiatives?
Definitely. The Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA, that's really a cornerstone.
PIDA.
Okay. Launched back in 2010. Think of it as the long-term strategic blueprint for the continent's infrastructure.
Right.
Its first phase, the Priority Action Plan 1, or PID PAP 1, that spanned from 2012 to 2040, theoretically.
A long time frame.
Yeah, very long term. And the aim was really enhancing Africa's competitiveness, global integration, through modern infrastructure. It included something like 51 programs, over 400 projects across energy, transport, water, ICT, the key sectors.
400 projects is a lot. And that plan has evolved now.
Exactly. We're now into PIDA 2.
Yeah.
That was adopted in 2021 and runs until 2030.
A shorter time frame then, more focused.
Seems so. It features 69 flagship projects, big ones, with an estimated total cost around $161 billion.
Still huge numbers.
Absolutely. And a key emphasis this time is on developing these integrated development corridors linking production zones to markets, ports.
Makes sense, connecting things up.
Yeah. And also ensuring that gender-sensitive policies are actually built into these infrastructure projects from the start, not just an afterthought.
That's an important shift. Now, we're also hearing a lot about various global strategies. How do things like the Global Gateway fit into this African picture?
Right. The Global Gateway. That, along with the Team Europe initiatives, it represents a major effort by the EU mainly to pool resources for big infrastructure projects globally, but with a really strong focus on Africa.
How much money are we talking?
The EU pledged a massive $300 billion worldwide. And $150 billion of that is specifically earmarked for Africa.
Half of it for Africa. That's significant.
It is. And you also have Italy's Mattei plan, which kind of aligns with this broader goal. The whole idea is that by, standardizing how things are done, clarifying who does what.
Streamlining.
Yeah, streamlining implementation, basically, making it more efficient, more impactful. They also talk about integrating key policy stuff like workforce training or setting up supportive regulations right into the infrastructure investments themselves.
So it's not just about pouring concrete.
Hopefully not, yeah. It's about ensuring those long-term benefits, skills development, better governance alongside the physical build.
And it looks like the G7 nations are also stepping up their focus on Africa.
They are. At the recent G7 summit in Italy, leaders specifically reaffirmed their commitment to supporting major infrastructure projects across Africa.
Any specific focus?
They particularly mentioned projects backed by the African Development Bank, the AFDB. Which makes sense. The AFDB has invested over, $50 billion in African infrastructure just in the last 8 years. They have the track record.
Okay.
And then there's the G7's own initiative, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, or PGII.
PGII, right.
Heard of that?
Yeah, even more ambitious goals there.
Mm-hmm.
They're aiming to mobilize something like $600 billion globally, and that includes significant commitments from U.S. investors, too.
So, wow. We're seeing a lot of plans. PIDA, Global Gateway, PGII. Lots of high-level commitments, big numbers being thrown around.
Yeah, definitely no shortage of plans. But what's the real picture on the ground? I mean, is all this actually translating into concrete progress? Tangible improvements for people?
Well, this is where the analysis from AutoNetPad provides a really critical perspective. A bit of a reality check, maybe.
Okay.
They point to this noticeable gap between the stated ambitions, the rhetoric, as they put it, and the actual outcomes, the reality, especially looking at strategies like the Global Gateway.
So a gap between talk and action.
In a way, yeah. I mean, they say there's strong political alignment, right? These global initiatives do line up with Africa's own infrastructure goals on paper, but translating that high-level agreement into, smooth operational coordination and effective on-the-ground implementation, that's where it's apparently been inconsistent since 2021.
Okay, so what specific challenges are holding things back? What did AutoNetPad identify?
Several key things come up. One is a big need for much clearer, more consistent communication about the Global Gateway strategy itself. To all the relevant stakeholders, in Africa, in Europe, making sure everyone actually understands the goals, the processes.
Getting everyone on the same page?
Exactly. And crucially, they mention a need for a greater sense of genuine ownership of these initiatives among the African partners, not just something being imposed from outside.
Right. Co-creation, not just consultation.
Precisely. The current portfolio of flagship projects under Global Gateway is also interesting. The fact that it includes only one dedicated development corridor. That's seen as quite notable, maybe a missed opportunity for that integrated approach. And furthermore, AutoNetPad observes this apparent emphasis on physical, hard infrastructure.
Roads, ports, power plants.
Yeah. Sometimes, they argue, at the expense of equally vital softer support, like providing regulatory expertise, investing in capacity building within African institutions, stuff that makes the hard infrastructure actually work well long-term.
So it's the whole ecosystem, not just the bricks and mortar.
Exactly. They say stakeholders need a much clearer info on how projects are picked, managed, financed, what the expected outcomes are. Really basic stuff, but essential to avoid duplication and make sure investments are genuinely impactful.
When we talk about financing these massive projects, billions and billions, the issue of debt, that has to come up, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge concern. There's a very real worry about making existing debt challenges, which many African nations face, even worse.
The debt trap narrative.
Yeah, and it's crucial that any new infrastructure investments actually contribute directly to tangible economic growth. They need to help improve debt to GDP ratios over time, not worsen them.
A fine line to walk.
It really is. The Adaran-Nepad paper also raises another interesting point about competing global incentives. Things like the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act.
How does that affect Africa?
Well, the concern is that such massive subsidy programs elsewhere could potentially divert crucial investment funds away from African initiatives. If the returns look better or easier elsewhere, money might follow.
Right. Capital flight or just capital distraction.
Exactly. It just underscores the need for a more equitable, globally coordinated framework for this kind of investment so everyone gets a fair shot.
It also sounds like implementing these really large-scale, regional, cross-border projects can be particularly tricky.
That's a huge point, yeah. We often see infrastructure projects get implemented more effectively, maybe more quickly at the national level.
Why is that? Just simpler.
Simpler, fewer cooks in the kitchen. Regional projects, crossing borders, they face just inherent complexities. Coordination between different governments is tough.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And, understandable competing national priorities. Each country might naturally focus on maximizing its immediate local benefits.
Even if it slightly undermines the bigger regional picture.
Potentially, yeah. Even if it comes at the expense of those larger shared advantages from a truly transnational initiative.
But those big regional projects connecting countries are vital, aren't they? For trade, integration.
Oh, absolutely vital. They're key for achieving Africa's broader development agenda, like the Continental Free Trade Area. So finding ways to ensure strong alignment with the funders and fostering genuine co-ownership with regional bodies, the regional economic communities, RECs, Adaran-Nepad itself, that's essential if these critical projects are going to succeed.
Okay, let's maybe shift gears a bit. African Leadership magazine, you mentioned them earlier, they seem to present a more optimistic picture, highlighting advancements.
They do, yeah. They talk about an unprecedented transformation happening in Africa's infrastructure landscape.
Unprecedented, strong word.
It is. They point to notable architectural advancements, technological progress, things that are increasingly aligning with, the digital age, but also the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically SDG 9.
SDG 9. That's one about resilient infrastructure, industrialization, innovation.
That's the one. Building resilient infrastructure, promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization, fostering innovation. They see real movement there.
And are there specific countries they mention as sort of leading the pack in this tech leap?
Yeah, they specifically flag South Africa, Egypt, and Tunisia as leaders in technological advancement, showcasing developments in modern transportation networks, more resilient energy systems. They highlight South Africa's SDG 9 rating 70.8 as a sign of its strong commitment.
So concrete examples.
Yeah, tangible stuff like large-scale solar energy projects in Egypt, big wind energy initiatives in Morocco.
Right, leveraging renewables.
Exactly. And the development of smart city projects in various places. Those are aimed at improving urban life, sure, but also attracting more investment, particularly in sustainable infrastructure.
But even with this progress, the magazine doesn't gloss over the challenges, right? They still emphasize those.
No, absolutely not. They make it clear the long-standing obstacles are still very real.
Such as?
Well, the persistent issue of limited financial resources, that's still there. Ongoing political instability in some regions, that obviously hinders things. And the need for more robust, effective regulatory frameworks.
Soft infrastructure again.
Exactly. The magazine also points out how inadequate transport or unreliable energy can just strangle trade and stifle industrial growth. It's a direct break on the economy.
Makes sense.
And of course, the massive elephant in the room, the increasing threat of climate change, how that impacts the long-term integrity, the resilience of all this infrastructure, that's a major, major concern.
Yeah, building for a changing climate adds a whole new layer of complexity.
It really does. They also highlight the lack of integrated planning and effective collaboration across different government departments between national and local levels as a big factor leading to inefficiencies. Wasted effort, wasted money sometimes.
So given all that, what are the key recommendations from African Leadership magazine? How do they suggest keeping the positive momentum going while tackling these obstacles?
Their recommendations really focus on several key areas. First, pretty obviously, the need for more investment, both domestic and foreign. But, and this is crucial always, with a strong, continuous focus on making sure it's sustainable from a debt perspective.
Don't borrow your way into trouble.
Basically, yeah. Second, they strongly advocate for promoting public-private partnerships, PPPs.
Okay.
But, and this is the important part, with transparent, equitable frameworks, clear roles, clear responsibilities for both the public and the private side, no hidden surprises.
Get the contracts right.
Exactly. Third, enhancing education and skills training. You need the skilled workforce to actually build, maintain, and innovate around this new infrastructure.
Building human capital alongside physical capital.
Precisely. They also recommend really leveraging digital technologies for more sustainable resource management, smarter infrastructure development, and creating incentives to help tech startups grow in these areas.
Fostering local innovation.
Yeah. And finally, they underscore, again, the vital importance of strengthening governance and regulatory frameworks right across the board, reducing corruption, ensuring projects are actually implemented effectively and accountably.
Seems like a solid set of recommendations. Now let's turn to that private sector perspective you mentioned, and we're drawing on some insights from Mr. David Davies for this.
David Davies.
He's a director at a company called Izenzo Consulting and Contracting.
Okay, Izenzo.
What's their angle?
What's particularly interesting about their approach is this focus on identifying and revitalizing what they call value-dead assets.
Value-dead assets, what are those?
Basically, underutilized land or buildings held by state-owned enterprises, SOEs, or by municipalities. Stuff that isn't generating the value it could be.
Okay, dormant potential.
Exactly. Their core strategy is what they call valorization, which involves things like rezoning land, finding new adaptive reuses for old buildings, basically repurposing these assets to unlock their hidden economic potential.
Interesting concept.
And they report having a pretty substantial pipeline of what they describe as shovel-ready projects, infrastructure development right across Africa, valued at over $50 billion, they claim.
Wow, $50 billion in potential projects.
Yeah, offering a whole spectrum of opportunities for investors right through the project lifecycle, from feasibility studies to construction to long-term operation.
They mentioned a twin opportunity. What do they mean by that?
Right, the twin opportunity. They see this convergence happening. On one hand, you have this massive potential for asset valorization, unlocking value from existing assets. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, you have the urgent growing need for new infrastructure development, mostly driven by really rapid urbanization across the continent.
So urbanization is the link.
It's a key driver, yeah. Assets that maybe used to be on the edge of town.
Right.
As cities expand, they suddenly become centrally located, prime real estate. This creates huge opportunities to redevelop or repurpose them as anchors for new urban growth, new essential infrastructure.
Makes sense. Turning old liabilities into new assets.
Kind of, yeah. But they also stress these large-scale city regeneration projects, they're inherently complex. You need thorough technical studies, tons of stakeholder consultation, really careful master planning. It's not simple.
Definitely not. Did they give a specific example, a case study?
They did, yeah. They talked about the Grahamstown story in South Africa.
Okay, what happened in Grahamstown?
Well, it provides a pretty concrete illustration of their approach. It involved strategically relocating the town's existing golf course.
Moving a golf course. Why?
To facilitate planned town expansion, it freed up prime land right near the town center for developing a much-needed new retail center and also some affordable housing.
Okay, unlocking land value.
Exactly. And critically, when the local municipality hit a funding shortfall for a really necessary upgrade to the sewage system—
a common problem.
Very common. Izenzo apparently helped facilitate an innovative solution, an outsourced build-operate-transfer BOT arrangement.
BOT.
And land swaps were used as part of the financing mechanism. So the municipality didn't necessarily need cash up front. They used land assets.
Clever. Using land as currency, almost.
In a way. They also mention other initiatives they're involved with in that region, Grahamstown and nearby Port Alfred. Things like reopening the local airport, valorizing underused railway links, potentially creating a marina, beachfront developments. They see it as a multi-billion rand opportunity altogether.
So they're quite active in that specific area. It sounds like they've really broadened their capabilities beyond just identifying these assets.
They have. They actually established a complementary company called Civitas.
Civitas.
Yeah, specifically to upscale their development and project management capabilities. to handle the bigger, more complex projects that come out of the initial valorization work Izenzo does.
That's Izenzo finds the opportunity. Civitas helps build it out.
Sort of, yeah. Together, they offer this comprehensive suite of services, everything from securing the capital needed to actually crafting the large-scale development plans, ensuring they deliver real developmental benefits for the community, creating synergy between the asset stuff and core business goals, and navigating all the complex city approvals.
That sounds like a wide range of skills needed.
It is, and the Civitas team apparently brings a lot of experience. Their track record includes involvement in some major strategic initiatives like the Gauteng 2055 strategy, the big Orar Tambo Airport IDZ project, even the V&A waterfront in Cape Town.
Okay, so they've worked on significant projects before. How do they structure these deals typically?
Their model usually involves working really closely with both private sector investors and government entities. Often they manage specific projects within separate legal entities, special purpose vehicles or SPVs.
Right.
And these SPVs have varied capital structures depending on the project and the investors, and usually clearly defined exit options for those investors down the line.
Provides clarity for everyone involved. Okay, let's bring in the final perspective now from Clyde & Co. You said they raise broader questions about sustainability.
Yes, indeed. Clyde & Co. acknowledges, look, infrastructure investment has played a significant role in underpinning Africa's economic growth over the last couple of decades. That's clear.
Right.
They point to high-profile mega projects like the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya, or the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the GERD. Big, visible example.
Yeah, projects everyone's heard of.
Exactly. However, they also highlight this. Well, this concerning trend where sustained levels of infrastructure investment haven't always consistently translated into maintained or equivalent levels of GDP growth across the continent.
So, you build a road, but the expected economic boom doesn't always follow or doesn't last.
That seems to be the concern, yeah. It raises important questions about the long-term viability, the overall effectiveness of relying so heavily on an infrastructure-led development model. Is it always the best or only path?
What are some of the key challenges they see threatening the stability of this model?
They point to several critical interconnected things. First, again, the financing gaps and, crucially, rising levels of public debt in many African countries. That's a major vulnerability.
We keep coming back to debt.
We do. Second, the persistent problems of corruption and mismanagement within these big infrastructure projects. They continue to divert huge resources. Clyde & Co. cites the AFDB estimate that corruption costs Africa something like $148 billion annually.
Wow. That's more than the estimated annual need for infrastructure investment.
It puts it in perspective, doesn't it? Third, large projects often carry significant environmental and social risks. Think population displacement, environmental degradation. They mentioned the GERD again, or issues around mining in the DRC as examples.
The human and environmental cost.
Exactly. And finally, geopolitical risks. Regional conflicts, the influence of external actors. These can disrupt projects, hike up costs, strain relations. They give the Alapset Corridor project linking Kenya, South Sudan, Ethiopia as an example, facing those kinds of challenges.
Okay, so a fairly sobering list of challenges. But do they also see opportunities? Ways to strengthen stability, make it more sustainable?
Yes, they do. They definitely emphasize the huge potential of better regional cooperation and integration, especially through initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AFCFTA. If goods and services can move more freely, the infrastructure becomes much more valuable.
Makes sense. The network effect.
Right. They also highlight the importance of exploring and adopting more innovative financing models. We talked about PPPs. They mentioned the Lekki Toll Road in Nigeria as a case study there, warts and all. Also things like impact investing, blended finance approaches.
Ways to bring in private money without just relying on government debt.
Exactly. Reducing reliance on sovereign debt, maybe bringing more efficiency. And finally, they stress again that critical need for sustained capacity building and real governance reforms, improving transparency, accountability, overall efficiency in how projects are managed.
So governance and finance innovation seem key.
Very much so.
And Clyde & Co. concludes with a rather thought-provoking alternative perspective, you said.
They do. It's quite interesting. Given all those challenges associated with the pure infrastructure-led growth model, they suggest considering a potential strategic pivot towards agriculture-led development.
Agriculture instead of infrastructure.
Maybe not instead of, but perhaps as a complementary or even alternative primary pathway. especially for achieving long-term stability and more inclusive economic growth.
Why agriculture specifically?
Well, they argue agriculture is still the foundational sector in many, many African economies. It provides huge levels of employment, contributes substantially to GDP.
Right, feeds people, employs people.
Exactly. So they propose increased targeted investments in things like modern farming techniques, better irrigation, improving rural infrastructure, generally roads to get produce to market, storage.
Supporting the whole agricultural value chain.
Yeah, alongside implementing supportive agricultural policies from governments. Basically arguing that strengthening the agricultural base might provide a more stable, more broadly beneficial foundation for development in many contexts.
That's a really interesting counterpoint to the mega project focus.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, we've covered a huge amount of ground here.
I really have.
From the massive funding gaps to the complex global and regional initiatives, the on-the-ground challenges, the role of the private sector, sustainability concerns, even this alternative focus on agriculture. What are the main sort of interconnected themes that really stand out when you pull all these threads together?
Yeah, several key themes just keep coming up, don't they? First, undeniably, the significant persistent infrastructure needs across Africa, side by side with those substantial financing gaps. That's the fundamental starting point.
The core problem.
Right.
Then we've explored all the strategic efforts being made, PIDA, Global Gateway, PGII, these big plans. But we've also had to acknowledge the very real complex challenges in actually translating those plans into effective on-the-ground implementation.
For rhetoric versus reality gap.
Exactly. The increasing and, I think, evolving role of innovation and the active involvement of the private sector, like the Izenzo example, shows that's another crucial piece of the puzzle right now.
Finding new ways to get things done.
Yeah. And underpinning absolutely all of this are those critical considerations around long-term sustainability, environmental, social, and especially financial sustainability. The debt question looms large.
It certainly does. It's definitely a multifaceted, incredibly dynamic landscape.
Ah.
So many interconnected factors influencing what happens next.
No simple answers.
Definitely not. So considering everything we've talked about today, all the different financing ideas, the vital need for governance reforms, the potential of regional collaboration, even that pivot towards agriculture. Here's a final question maybe for you listening to ponder.
What single factor, if you had to pick one, do you believe holds the greatest potential to truly unlock sustainable and impactful infrastructure development across the African continent? And what's the core reason behind your thinking? Is it money, governance, collaboration, a different focus entirely?
That's a great question to leave people with.
Something to really consider.
Absolutely. And we really encourage you to continue exploring these vital topics. Consider all the diverse perspectives that we've tried to bring together today. As we said, there are certainly no easy answers here, but gaining that comprehensive understanding, seeing all these different facets, it's absolutely key to grasping the future trajectory of infrastructure development in Africa.
This is Afrotake's article in conversation, and we'll see you next time.